So let's begin with you, Sherry. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and the communities that have been impacted that you work with?
Sure. So I am a trauma therapist, and I'm also the author of Thriving After Trauma, Stories of Living and Healing. I've been counseling people who've survived a variety of traumas for about 23 years. And in all of my years of practice, never have I experienced what we have been going through these last 3 or 4 months. Um, so I work with people who come to therapy usually after years later when they've experienced something like childhood abuse, domestic violence, combat, natural disaster, sudden loss. So a lot of times I meet people 5, 10, 20 years after they've survived whatever they have survived. I also am working with right now a bunch of teenagers who are living in situations where there's no obvious or imminent danger, but they're living in situations where they don't feel safe emotionally. For example, I'm working with some teenagers who are going through gender issues, who are living secret lives after recognizing that they're trans or that they're struggling with identity issues. I also work with some teenagers who come from families where they have parents, but their parents are dealing with their own issues around depression or are having different types of personality disorders like narcissism. So there are a lot of teenagers right now actually that I'm working with who are safe physically but don't feel safe emotionally. So I know when Dr. Laura asked me to come on today, I was trying to think about how can I talk to you about what the quarantine has been like and the challenges that we are all facing. And I think what I would say is there's certain themes that I'm noticing, whether it's somebody that I'm working with who's in therapy because of something that happened to them 10 years ago, or I'm working with a teenager right now who's struggling with some of the same feelings. And one of the biggest things that I recognize as we go through the quarantine is the isolation that people are struggling with and the sense of loss. People who've lived through trauma will talk about feeling stranded. They talk to me about feeling like nobody understands. And one of the things that I work on with people when we're going through the recovery process before the quarantine is really trying to think about how to reach out and how to develop a support network so that they don't have to keep feeling like they're living by themselves. And one of the things that people are really struggling with, myself included, because I'm also a survivor of childhood abuse, is that the some of the forms of outreach that we had before quarantine are no longer there. For example, a lot of people that I work with are members of different types of support groups, or they've created safety, whether it's a yoga class or a group of friends that they hang out with. So one of the things that people are talking about is I can't go to those classes anymore, or I can't sit at dinner or coffee with some of these people and just talk about what I'm feeling. So I think that that isolation, that sense of disconnection is a huge issue when I'm talking with teenagers who really very heavily rely on their peers for support, that's also an issue because sometimes just being able to sit in the room with somebody, even if you're not talking to them, just being able to sit in the room with somebody and look into their eyes and know that they are not alone and that somebody knows what they're going through is extremely helpful. So one of the things that I'm trying to help people with is how to stay connected and how to continue to reach out in a time when we can't sit with people. So I think now more than ever, we really as a community need to be reaching out to people, especially if you know somebody that's a trauma survivor or you're a trauma survivor, to say to yourself, even though I can't do some of the things I used to do, that doesn't mean that I can't talk to people or that I need to live in isolation. So even if when you think about what we're doing here today, just knowing that you're listening to somebody else who may have similar experiences, that can actually be very helpful. So I just wanted to talk for a minute about what are some things that you can do if you're a trauma survivor, or what are some things that you can do if you know somebody, or if you're friends with somebody who has a teenager that's really struggling. And I think what I would say is if you are a survivor and you're experiencing loss and anger and fear and isolation, the most important thing that I would stress over and over is make sure you're reaching out. Try and see people, FaceTime with people, set up FaceTime dinner, or go to a yoga class with a friend and do the yoga class at the same time. The other thing I think that's important right now is if you can't access somebody over the phone or you can't actually see somebody, still go to your yoga classes, go online and look for those classes. If you have pets, try to really get outside, take walks, go for hikes. One of the other things that I've been noticing, which I really love about our community, is there's now more than ever, there are so many resources online. So if you're having a day where you just can't connect with one of your friends, or you're not able to see a therapist, go online and look for different type of support groups that are specifically focused for your community. So look for a support group that's for childhood abuse survivors. Look for a support group that deals with gender issues. And even if you don't want to talk, even if you just want to hop on the support group and listen to what other people are saying, those are all ways that you can stay connected and feel less alone. And I think too, I I really am noticing that people are getting more depressed. They're going into more shame and fear. And if you notice that about yourself, if you feel like I just can't do this anymore, or if you're feeling hopeless, or if you're feeling like this is never going to end, those are the days when you really want to make contact, whether again it's through support online or talking to a friend or even finding a therapist. Even if you've never been to therapy before, there are so many opportunities now via telehealth where really, if you're able to get online, you can find therapists that are offering teletherapy, and there are services that you can find that are very low in cost. So that's something else I wanted to make sure I mentioned to people. The other thing I was thinking about as I was thinking about doing this today is if you're somebody that likes to write, or you're somebody that likes to sing or do art, this is also a time, even if you were doing that before, now's the time when you want to grab your journal or think about music that really inspires you, and constantly remind yourself of what are the things that feel familiar and what are the things that are different as I'm going through this quarantine, to really be able to separate what's about now and the quarantine and the stressors, and what's about my history, and how can I find ways to remind myself that there is safety even in a situation that at times feels uncertain and unsafe. So those are some things that I was thinking about, but please feel free to ask questions as we go through the webinar. If I'm missing something, if you have specific questions, feel free to ask and I would be happy to try and answer.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Thank you so much. And Karma Cotton, are you with us now?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Karma. I don't think we can see your video yet. There you are. Welcome.
Hi.
So, Karma, tell us a little bit about what you do and the particular communities that you've been working with. And as Sherry was talking about, how have they been impacted by COVID-19 and quarantine, and now what's coming down the pipeline of lack of funding and resources?
Sure. So I'm Karma Cotman, and I am Executive Director with UJIMA, which is the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. And so we have been impacted by COVID in a number of different ways, as I'm sure folks have seen in terms of the disparate impact of COVID on communities of color, and particularly on the Black community, which for so many reasons, in terms of disparate access to health care, to the disparate access to safe and affordable housing, so longstanding systemic inequities, in addition to being in quarantine and the stay-at-home orders that then impacted victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, who were at home with their abusers and or with the individuals that have assaulted them. We've seen this in the adult population as well as in the youth population, where we don't often have conversations about the impact on youth who are at home and at risk due to, being at home with their abuser, as is the same in the adult population, and or because of the disparate access to childcare. And so when we think about, how funding then impacts our community, and I have to tell you, I work in coalition with a number of different organizations that specifically focus on communities of color. So my sister organizations that work in the Latina community and in the Asian community, who are also working on the intersections of the impact of COVID and violence against women or domestic violence and sexual assault. And similarly, we're seeing current themes that are running across all of our communities, and for similar reasons in terms of systemic inequities, but also because many of our communities are on the front lines, and so they are working in positions where they are essential workers and did not have the ability to stay at home or work from home during this time, so their exposure was increased as well. So when we talk about access to financial resources, for much of our community, the lack of access happened in multiple ways. For individuals, so for those who are seeking services or seeking resources, their lack of financial infrastructure to get to our communities was certainly then heightened as it relates to COVID. Right. And so when you think about how to get access to safe and affordable food, because many of our communities are living in food deserts. Many of our communities are also living in transportation deserts. So they had to take transportation to then get to work as essential workers, and they're sort of crowded into spaces because either public transportation was not running, or it had been reduced to a capacity where you had larger crowds in spaces to get folks there. And so then, again, increased exposure. What we saw, though, from a service provider perspective is that access to things like payroll protection loans was not the same for those organizations that are small and that were serving communities of color. Because, for instance, you had to have relationships with larger banks. And then those banks then prioritize who gained access based on the funding that they had in like their bank account or their checking account and things like that. And so for smaller, particularly nonprofits serving communities of color, that was an added barrier to accessing those financial resources, right? And then from a systemic level, challenges for communities of color, particularly in pandemics, and we know the longstanding issues related to accessing resources during the pandemic and then immediately after. So when there is an economic downturn, those economic downturns disparately impact communities of color, whether it is through a pandemic or a recession, as we're seeing that we're now moving into.
Yes, thank you so much for giving us a full kind of picture of also the intersectionality of marginalization, right? How it's not just belonging to one community, but also all of the other aspects of identity that can create additional barriers.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Bill Murray count and ask you. So, I see Ella now. Ella, can you hear
her too?
Yes, I can.
All right.
There she is.
Ella, can you share with us what communities you're working with and how they've been impacted?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ella Marquez. I am a transgender woman. I am not directly, having a kind of a support group. I am part of many support groups for transgender people, but I am not the leading person there. But I have been in touch since this pandemic and all these very, very large changes in our society. I've been very active as well with my groups. Some people have experienced quite a lot of financial issues. That is mainly because there is a small part of the community, or a part of the community, which has to do with kind of services, personal services, and they could not do their jobs anymore. So they don't have any money to get. They didn't got any money anymore. And it's been an issue for them. So some of us, we have been trying to give them food and going around. I've been a very privileged person because I've got too many issues. I'm surviving, although my company is not doing so well right now as most of companies here, but we're doing pretty okay. And but in the transgender community, it has been difficulty. There's many people which have got literally living day to day. Many people are working in the restaurant business, so they've lost their jobs. Many people have lost their jobs. So, but I think many of them are surviving, and I've not heard so bad things about it. So, what everybody's trying to do is try to keep a positive opinion. We have something called Trans Gurus. We try to share the positive opinion of the people. Myself personally, it has been actually a great time because I was trying to finish my second book for a long time, almost 2 years, and now I had the opportunity to do it. And as a matter of fact, I've done a third book, which I'm right now in the process of editing with my editor, so it'll come out in a couple of weeks.
Wonderful. Very exciting. And yes, I definitely think that there have been many positive aspects as well. Bill, let's see. Bill, are you there? All right. Bill, if you come back on, hopefully you can join us in a little bit. But Sherry, I'm going to come back to you and ask about, so people are hearing about all these issues, they're concerned, they care, but they might not be sure, what can they do? If this isn't their direct experience, how can they support the people who are experiencing these things?
It's a great question. And I think the best thing to do is, rather than try to fix it or make your loved one or your friend feel better, just reach out to them and ask them things like, are you doing okay? Do you feel like you need help? Is there anything that I can talk to you about to try to help you feel less alone? So I think really just knowing that everybody's different and everybody needs something different. I think as as a loved one or a friend, we never want to see somebody struggling, and our human instinct is to want to fix it. This is not something that you can fix, but I know that sometimes when people just say things to me like, this won't last forever, or you've already been through so much, and while there may be times when you think I can't go through this too, you can do it. So to also maybe just really remind your friends or your loved ones about all the strengths that they have, that they've had this whole time and that they had before COVID, to just empower them and to say to them, just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean that that's what it is, and it doesn't mean that it's all of who you are. So to really just focus on the positives, and remember, again, you can't fix it, and to ask your friend or loved one, what is it that I can do to help? And maybe just to even at times reach out and just say, I've been thinking about you. How's it going? Those are really the things that really can be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes people feel like, this is such a big problem. Again, there are so many systemic issues at play. How can I possibly be part of the solution? So even doing those simple things can be very powerful. Karma, can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on supporting, again, survivors in the communities that you are working with? How people on the outside can be supportive?
Sure. I think consistent with what we just heard, sometimes it's important to just ask, how can I be there? What can I do right now that is most supportive? I think also right now what we are seeing is a convergence of several things happening. There are a lot of conversations about COVID. People have been at home due to stay-at-home orders, and at the same time, there are a lot of conversations about race and systemic inequities. And there are lots of trauma and trigger happening, particularly for women in communities of color. And so I think it is incumbent upon all of us to also get educated, because, you know, in as much as we want to ask, what can I do? Or is there something that I can do for you? It is also important for us to become educated about what are our roles ourselves, so that when we're asking that question, we're not asking the people who have consistently been on the front lines, or who are consistently overly impacted, or who are consistently dealing with all of these systemic issues to figure it out for us, right? That becomes then another added issue for those communities to have to navigate. So I think in as much as we're doing the asking, we also come with some suggestions, and not suggestions that means we're going to take over in terms of how I'm suggesting things for the community that's impacted, but within my own community, what can we be doing to actively participate and actively engage in conversations that address systemic inequities?
Yes, exactly. So can you give us a little additional insight into what you're speaking to with like the emotional labor piece?
Sure. So, I mean, emotionally, you know, the COVID pandemic has been both an economic and public health crisis, right? And so emotionally, people are dealing with seeing their loved ones essentially be sick, and or they're not able to, particularly in some communities where there is the impetus to deal with crisis in a communal way. During this time, they're unable to get the hands-on support from family and friends, particularly those that may have multi-generational families where they're not able to see their parents right now. You're not able to see your grandparents right now, your aunts, your uncles. And so your immediate family that often offers that emotional support, folks are feeling like distanced, right? And so I often say right now, Zoom has become a lot of our best friends, but it also underscores, right, technological inequities, because it means that you have to have the internet to get onto Zoom. And so what we are also leaning on to be those emotional supports in terms of being able to connect with families still means that you have to have some level of access. For others, it means that they take the risk of putting that family member or that friend in danger of, you know, having some level of contraction, or they just don't have that connection. And so when you ask about the, you know, what are the emotional impacts, they're multi-leveled. But I think what I have seen continuously in almost every community is the creativity and resiliency of community. And so that people are using mechanisms like Zoom. They are driving by homes and just waving from the street. They are, you know, taking this time to connect with family and friends on a deeper level. So simple things like having meals together when they used to be on the go, or having discussions, or taking the time out to just ask a simple question like, are you okay? And what can I do? But I think it's just important, I think you raised earlier, that this is a time of great intersection, right? Where we're seeing the intersection of a public health crisis, an economic health crisis, an economic crisis, as well as the raising of issues that have been longstanding inequities. And so particularly for communities of color, all of those things converging is incredibly triggering. And so figuring out how to navigate that. And I say, you know, for a lot of communities, reaching out to mental health professionals and seeking counseling has been something that, you know, folks have shied away from. But in this time, that's also something that, you know, we suggest is like, even if you don't want to reach out to someone for traditional mental health services, taking the time to practice some form of self-care, you know, whatever that form of self-care is for you, taking the time to practice some form of self-care is incredibly important.
Yes, and definitely not to be undervalued. Ella, can you speak to us a little bit about how people can be supporting the trans community if they are not a member of the community, but they want to contribute? Ella?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about supporting the trans community if there are allies listening to this and they want to be part of that conversation, they want to be supportive, but they're not sure where to start?
Okay. Um, Look, the transgender community is a very large community, but it is not, I mean, it's probably not so wonderfully organized as many other communities. But there is quite a lot of places like internet. I mean, you can contact us with Trans Gurus. If you're a local in South Florida, we've got places like, SunServe, everything. They are doing a hell of a lot of work for our community. That means that they've got people actually going out, giving stuff to them. You've got the Compass Center in Lake Worth in South Florida. But I think that the most important thing that how can you support the trans community, and believe me, our community is like every other community. We've got our issues, but it's just to be normal, to accept, to not discriminate, and that is the basic thing. That it always has to be done, not only in difficult times. Unfortunately, the trans community has got a hell of a lot of discrimination. There's quite a lot of discrimination coming out, and we really need to have the support of the people. It just starts by telling outright, she or he or whatever, and not misgendering us. Unfortunately, it is still a very big issue, and when mainly with violence and police, transgender community suffers a lot, really suffers a lot. So misgendering, it can be a very big issue. So it starts there, and in times of violence, which is right now happening a lot, it's really worst.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that, what those experiences are? Like you're saying, it's worse. Can you give us a picture of what that looks like, and again, how people can be supportive?
Sure. I just give you a good example. Very often when there are problems like this, transgender women are put into jail. They are put into jail of the wrong gender, very often with men. They get abused, raped. It is really terrible. It is really terrible. Unfortunately, not all the states and not everywhere is prepared to have a jail which is only for one sex, meaning they put either male or female jails. There is no jails for for transgender people, and this can be an issue if they are misgendered, and it happens a lot. You have to understand that in our community, unfortunately, transitioning means going from A to B, and some people have not reached B yet, so their IDs are not correct. They probably do not present as good as they should. Mainly the issue with the IDs, it's always a big thing, because they present as a woman and they've got an ID of a man, and probably the photograph is not exactly updated. So it can be a very big issue.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for giving us that picture. We have a few minutes left, and so I'd love to open it up to questions and answers, and see if anyone wants to you'll see on the left side of your screen a Q&A button. So if you would like to ask us any questions for any of our panelists, we will open that up now. All right, well, we're waiting for questions and answers. I would love to hear from Karma again, just on any final thoughts on supporting communities, on being a good ally, and on understanding, again, all of these systemic issues and how people can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Karma, can you hear us?
It went out for a minute, so I had to rejoin. Can you repeat the question? Certainly.
Yes. Yeah, so just any final thoughts, on how people can actionably be part of the solution instead of the problem, right? People might say, well, I'm not part of the problem. I'm not, doing anything wrong. But if you're not part of the solution, in a way, we are ultimately contributing to the problem. So how can people be those active allies?
So I think the first one is becoming educated, right? Becoming educated about when individuals, and particularly those from marginalized communities, are talking about systemic inequities. What are they referencing? What does that mean? Becoming educated about how systems are disparately impacting communities and why people are saying that they feel marginalized. Then second, talking to those in your circle that are trusted about what supports you can provide and what supports you can offer. And third, just doing the hard work of finding out from other family and friends that you are in closest contact that are not from marginalized communities. How can we come together to be supportive? There is so much information right now, right, about how to be a good ally. There are lots of different programs, and by programs, I mean lots of different ways to either lend resources or lend your voice. And so, I certainly can share with you that you can share with the group some of those resources after the webinar, because I think one of the most important things is to just do that work for yourself around, here's some great web resources around how I can lend to some of the legal defense funds for those individuals that are safely and are protesting, but are doing so in a way that is safe, etc. How can I talk about systemic racism, etc., with my family and friends? And there are lots of great tools and tips around how to do that. How can I lend my voice around voter registration and things like that? And that's not about political affiliation. It's more about making sure that everyone has their voices heard. So there are lots of different ways, but the first step is about you, and that is all of us individually becoming educated about how systemic oppression impacts us.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. And we will definitely share all of those resources with anyone who has watched today, and also when we share the recording of this broadcast. Sherry, let's end with you sharing any final thoughts that you have on folks being supportive, being active allies, being part of the solution.
I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about as we're going through the webinar is, even in times of challenge and uncertainty, there's good things that can come out of that. I know that Karma was talking before about the importance of being able to do things like sit down with your families and eat dinner. There are some good things that are coming out of this. And I think what I would say is, if you are trying to instill hope or offer light and positivity, that's the messages that you also want to give to people who are really just feeling hopeless and trapped and afraid, is to try to keep thinking about what are the opportunities here. And for many people in recovery, while there are so many challenges facing us as we go through these times, this is a time when, because life has slowed down and because there's things that we can't do right now, we can work more on our own recovery, and we can focus in on things about what we're trying to reclaim that maybe we didn't give attention before, just because we didn't have the time or we didn't feel like we were in a space where we can do that. So I think always try to focus on what is something good that can come out of this, and how can I take my anger and my fear and my rage and flip it into something that would be positive. So a positive action, continuing to use your voice and fight for things that need to be different, whether it is about racism or inequality or domestic violence, to think about, now maybe there's an opportunity for me to use a platform or get myself out there so that my voice can be heard. And not only can I empower myself, but maybe I can also empower others in the process.
Definitely. Exactly. And for folks who are wanting to start that journey within, what advice do you have for them? Maybe some unlearning that they have to do, or increasing their own awareness around maybe biases they have even against themselves.
I think the best thing to do in that situation is to grab a pen and paper and start writing. Sometimes when we sit down and we write, we realize things about ourselves or our thoughts that maybe aren't completely in our consciousness. So to be able to give yourself permission to do a little bit more exploring, just so that you can look a little deeper into what are some things about me that I really need and want to understand, or what I want to work on.
Yes, wonderful advice. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and everyone who has joined us today. We will have a recording of this webinar available by this evening, and we will also have further information on how to get in touch with each of the panelists that you heard today. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a safe and happy weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in some of our future webinars. Thank you.